All right, you guys. Well, we've got four main categories we're going to be talking about tonight, and we're going to start by talking about this character. We've talked about him a little bit last week, and maybe you got the vibe that he's a bit of a controversial character. And this is a guy named Constantine the Great. But the Great is the big question mark, because depending on who you talk to, he either provided these tremendous advances for Christianity or he corrupted Christianity. So, in order to understand the history of the church moving past the fourth century, we've got to spend some time with Constantine. What's the background with this guy? He was born the end of the third century, and he lived until close to the midway of the fourth century. Now, he was born at a time when the Roman Empire had actually become so big and was so sprawling that one emperor was not able to keep a good grip on everything. So they had actually split the role of emperor into four different roles. And so you had basically two different Caesars and two different Augustuses. So in the past, that was all consolidated in one guy, but then they split it up into four different roles. And Constantine's father was one of those four emperors. And when his father died, Constantine was set to inherit not just his father's reign, but he was also expected to be given a bit of a promotion. And actually, his territory was going to be dramatically expanded, including the city of Rome itself. So it was fully expected that Constantine would sit in Rome and he would rule over a considerable part of this empire. But there was one of the other emperors whose name was Maxentius, and Maxentius is a very aspiring fellow. And so he wants to capitalize on the situation. He sees a vacant seat in Rome. He sees kind of young Constantine hasn't claimed it yet. And he thinks, I'm going to consolidate my power and make my domain a little bit bigger. So Maxentius takes about 100,000 soldiers, marches into Rome, and claims Constantine's seat as his own. Well, Constantine is not ready to go down without a fight. So in the year 311, he takes only about 40,000 troops and marches towards Rome. It seems a little crazy at first because Constantine is, of course, tremendously outnumbered here. And Maxentius knows it. He thinks, what is this idiot doing trying to march on me with less than half of my number of troops? So he is very confident in his ability to defeat Constantine. But he wants assurance, and he's very superstitious, like a good Roman emperor up until this point. He follows the Roman gods and the priests and everything like that. So he tries really desperately to get some oracle from a prophet, some prophecy that's going to assure him he's going to be able to defeat Constantine. And he has to go through a couple different ones. It's kind of like he has to open like 20 fortune cookies to get the one that he wants. And then finally he gets this oracle that says that he would defeat the enemy of Rome. And he thinks, oh, well, of course, the enemy of Rome is Constantine. And so I've got the assurance of this prophecy. So I can go out, I can just get this over with. We don't need to wait for Constantine to march into Rome. I can go out and take him out in the open. So he takes his troops and he rides out to meet Constantine in battle. Now, Constantine, up until this point, he had been raised in this polytheistic atmosphere of Roman religion, but he had become very suspicious of the Roman gods. He wasn't entirely convinced that they were the real deal. He knows there's something out there, but he's not quite sure what. Now, he had heard about this singular God, this one God who reigned over all other gods, but he wasn't sure if this God was legit. So he prays to this unknown God and he says, if you're out there, maybe you could do me a solid here and help me out. And then supposedly, according to Constantine, that night he has a dream. And in this dream, he sees a big cross in the sky with the words, by this sign, conquer. And he takes that as an indication that this is from and about Jesus. And so he obeys and he ends up, his banner that he uses to march into battle, he makes it this big giant cross. And actually, on the front of his soldiers' shields, he has painted, we talked about the Chi Rho. Remember, that's the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek. And that was a mark of early Christianity. And he has that painted on all of his soldiers' shields. And so he's saying, all right, well, let's see if this works, right? Let's see if this God is truly the real God. And amazingly, they win the battle. They end up driving Maxentius's men over what was called the Tiber River. And at this point in time, the Tiber River was really full. It probably had some rapids, it was bursting, it was going really quick. And in this attempt to escape, Maxentius actually falls into the water. He's wearing his really bulky, heavy armor at the time. So he actually sinks and drowns in the river. And later they actually went and found his body, supposedly cut off his head and paraded it around Rome. But when all this happens, Constantine realizes, I guess this Jesus is the real deal. And so he takes it as a sign that Christ is actually supreme over the Roman deities. And so later, Constantine would actually compare Maxentius's plunge into the river with the Red Sea wiping out Pharaoh and his army. And so Constantine, in this big show of victory, marches into Rome to take his rightful place. He's undisputed, he's uncontested, and now he is a Christian Roman emperor. 2 years later, in the year 313, he issues a very important ruling called the Edict of Milan, and that gives religious freedom to everybody within the empire, including Christians. Now, I want you to think for a moment about how important this would have been if you are a believer, because for centuries, you have been persecuted, you have been martyred, you live in this ever-present threat of suffering for the faith, and now suddenly, one of your own guys is sitting on the emperor's throne. This was a surefire sign to everybody. Christ had conquered the Roman gods, and he did it by conquering the heart of the Roman emperor. And so sort of this new day had begun. Now, as I've said, Constantine is a very controversial figure. Maybe even just in hearing that story, you're already thinking of some red flags where I'm a little suspicious of this. Now, we don't need to try to defend everything that Constantine did. We can admit some things that are a little suspicious. And there were certainly some negatives that came about from Constantine's reign. So I want to consider what some of those negatives were. So one of the things that resulted was what we would call cultural Christianity. When the church was being persecuted, it sort of weeded out the true confessors from the false, because you're only sticking with Jesus unto death if you really mean it. You have everything to lose. So the only people who are sticking to Christianity are the people who are really committed to it. Well, now it's in to be a Christian. And now you can be a culturally comfortable Christian. In fact, you can even be a little bit privileged as a Christian because one of your guys is on the throne. When the faith was being persecuted, only the really faithful guys would hold on to it. It produced a more pure and devoted church. But now, lukewarm Christians could get away with a lot more. They could get away with saying, oh yeah, I'm a Christian, without being required to commit any real sacrifice. Not only that, but many people would claim to be Christians just because, oh, maybe it gets me an in with the emperor, or maybe that's the culturally acceptable thing to do. Haven't we seen this happen it happened in America? Now we're on kind of a bit of a decline, but for a long time, Christianity was the cultural norm. And so a lot of people might just say, oh yeah, of course I'm a Christian. Yeah, of course I received baptism. That's just what you do without it being genuine in the heart. Now, the other thing that could be seen as a negative is that of institutional authority. And this has more to do with religion than politics. Last week, we talked about how Constantine called for this ecumenical council of bishops to come to Nicaea and settle this issue. Who is Jesus? Once and for all. Who is Jesus? Is he a created being or is he God the Son? Now, that was a good thing. I think Nicaea is worth celebrating. I think it's an important thing to recognize. The Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Protestant Church, all recognize Nicaea as a good thing. It solidified Trinitarian theology as the standard of orthodoxy. We can thank God for that. However, one of the negative repercussions that came about is this kind of got into everybody's head. Ecumenical councils are always authoritative. If we want to decide something, we just get one of these councils together, and whatever they declare, that is now true. And so as a result, the Roman Catholic Church since then has had 21 ecumenical councils that they regard as authoritative. And we would read some of the decisions of these councils and we would say, that is not biblical at all. But the Council of Nicaea, for as great as it was, also set this precedent where, oh, well, if the church says it in the council, it must be true. Now, those were some very real negative things. However, there's also some accusations brought against Constantine that maybe you've heard before. These criticisms come from Christians and from non-Christians. And I want to take a couple minutes to go through those because I think not all of them are warranted. So tell me if you've heard some of these before. Some will say that Constantine didn't legitimately convert to Christianity because he was convicted, but because it was political opportunism. Christianity was this growing group within his empire, and he wanted to capitalize on that movement by claiming to be one of them, and that would make him more popular. He could basically use this movement in his favor. He saw the rising wave and he rode the tide. So in this claim, Constantine, it was not about legitimate faith or trust. It was simply about a great opportunity. But there's a couple things we should keep in mind that I think would lend us to say this probably isn't the case. First of all, only about 5 to 10% of the Roman Empire was Christian at that time. So it's not like, 50, 60, 70% of the population was Christian. And so Constantine figured he'd better get on board. It was still a vast minority of the population. And this vast minority was an ostracized, oppressed group. They had no army, they had no political representation, they had no economic standing. They really weren't a threat to Constantine in any sort of political way. So, I mean, it's possible he saw it as this growing trend. It seems unlikely that he would jump on board with it just to, be popular with some crowd that was a vast persecuted minority. There's certain things that Constantine did that have caused people to raise their eyebrows and say, maybe he wasn't quite a Christian. For example, he didn't eliminate all of the pagan imagery off some of the Roman coins. He waited until his deathbed to be baptized. Although that was actually fairly common back then due to a faulty view with baptism. The idea of baptism was that it washed away original sin. So the whole idea was, if I get baptized too early on in life, I know I'm going to sin after that. And so I wait until the very end, and then I can go to meet God with sort of a clean slate. So this, I think, is not really indicative of Constantine's fake conversion, as it is just a faulty view on baptism. In many ways, he exhibited the marks of a genuine Christian. When you look at his writings and even in his personal life, he seems very devotional about his faith. There's several notable scholars of the early church and of Constantine in particular. Guys like Michael Haykin, he was my church history professor. Peter Leithart, he wrote a great book called Defending Constantine that I recommend. And they've pointed out Constantine, his conversion seems to be legitimate. Another accusation, he made Christianity the national religion of the empire. That is actually not true. He made the exercise of Christianity legal, and he promoted Christianity, but making Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire wouldn't actually come until 43 years after Constantine's death. Another claim, he invented the New Testament canon and the doctrine of the Trinity. This was made popular by Dan Brown's absurd book, The Da Vinci Code. The Da Vinci Code is not accepted as historically reliable, even by secular scholars. There's a history podcast I really recommend called The Rest is History. And the two guys who host it, they're not necessarily Christians, but they joke about Dan Brown. They're like, Dan Brown is a cruddy historian. Don't listen to anything he says. So these types of claims actually come from Dan Brown material. No serious scholar actually makes these claims. Another thing that will be said is that Constantine mixed church and state. In other words, he used the state to seize control of the church. Well, Constantine actually did no such thing. He maintained his distinct role as a secular ruler, but he did support the church, and he supported it by basically saying, church leaders, you do your job as theological and spiritual leaders. That's what the Council of Nicaea was. At Nicaea, Constantine did not say, guys, here's what I think the Trinity is like. Now go and make that a church law. He basically said, guys, I'm cool with this either way. I just want you guys to be on the same page. You guys are the Bible scholars. You sit down and talk about it. It's not for me to say. Constantine very much kept that role throughout the duration of his rule. Others will say that he mixed church and state by ruling too Christianly. Nowadays, we have this very sharp divide between church and state, and we're suspicious if someone rules politically on the basis of their Christian convictions. Now, I would argue that that's not always a bad thing. I think it can actually be a very good thing. And here's why. Here's kind of the rationale I provide there in the notes. First thing, Romans 13 tells us government is established by God as a good thing. And God has given the government the power of the sword. That means the government has the power and the force given by God to punish evildoers and to uphold good laws. Second principle, though, is that in 1 Timothy 2, we are called specifically to pray for the conversion of kings and political rulers. In other words, we are told to pray that those who bear the sword become Christians. Now, do you think that when someone who bears the sword becomes a Christian, they're expected to leave their Christianity at the door? Or do you think they're expected to resign their post because I can't work in politics anymore because I'm a Christian? No, in fact, there's several examples in the Gospels and in Acts where we have officials in the of the Roman Empire who come to faith, and they're told to turn away from their crooked practices, but they're not told to give up their post. So think about like the centurion who Jesus, commends his faith, or the centurion Cornelius, who Peter evangelizes to. They are not called to give up their position. So the assumption is they're going to continue to serve in this political, ruling, sword-bearing role, but now as a Christian. So I think when the early church sees this kind of thing, they would look at someone like Constantine becoming a Christian, and they would rejoice that someone is in this governmental role, but as a Christian. And so I think going in the other direction now, we can actually recognize what's positive, the good that God used to bring out of Constantine's reign. I highlight just a couple of them here. First, of course, the legal protection that it provided to Christianity. I think in order to fully appreciate Constantine, we have to put ourselves in the position of the church at the time that had been persecuted for all these years. Think about when the Edict of Milan is given in 313. Imagine you are an older Christian. You've been walking with the Lord for years. Your body is perhaps scarred and broken from being tortured for the name of Christ. You've seen loved ones and friends die on the rack because of their faith in Christ. You've watched them get torn apart alive in the arena. And now the Roman emperor professes faith in Christ and says, you're free to practice your faith in Christ. Can you imagine? You would weep with joy over something like that. What an incredible. In fact, there was one notable story where there was an older Christian who, in one of his torturings, had lost his eyeball. And supposedly, Constantine comes to this man and kisses the guy right on his socket as a way of showing his condolence and his love now towards these persecuted Christians. No Christian would look at that scene and say, oh, no, this is a bad thing, you guys. They would recognize it as a good thing. We see several instances of Constantine legislating with good Christian morality. He was the one who finally banished crucifixion. It had still been used in Rome up until Constantine. He put aside the Lord's Day, the first day of the week, as an official holiday. Another thing, and I really love this, because of Constantine, Christians were now encouraged, and at Constantine's behest, to produce better art and architecture. If you think about it, the Christians were kind of limited in their ability to produce good art and beautiful architecture simply due to the fact that they were an underground movement. You don't really have a whole lot of time to invest in beautiful buildings and create beautiful mosaics or paintings when you're on the run for your life. So the first couple centuries of Christianity does not produce a ton of art. But now that Christianity is free, Constantine encourages the utilization of Christian beauty. And so now, instead of meeting privately in homes, the Christians are actually able to build public places of worship. And they can beautify these public places of worship. They can make it architecturally pleasing. They can have these beautiful mosaics. They can have these pretty baptismal founts in the church itself. Now, what the Christians ended up doing is they borrowed a very common type of Roman building that was called the basilica. The basilica was basically the shape of a rectangle, and it was lined with columns on either side. So when the Christians start building their public church buildings, they adopt the form of the basilica. And I wanted to also take a moment to imagine what a joy that would be to finally have your own public building that you can construct. So the church that I grew up in, we met in a rec center and then a school for many, many years. And you've got fold-up chairs, and you put them, and it's just every week there was a whole setup crew and a tear-down crew, and you always felt like you're kind of living out of a tent. And I remember when our church, we bought our own property without going into debt, had the building put up, and I remember that first Sunday in our own building, there was no feeling like it, because it's like we finally have our own place to assemble and worship. And I can imagine what one of the first public Christian worship services would have been like in their own building. But what they did when they built these basilicas, they actually put a bit of a twist on it, because the basilica is rectangular shaped. And what the Christians did is they took another shorter rectangle and put it on the back end so that the basilica is now in the shape of a cross. And so the altar is kind of up here so you walk in here, the altar's here, and then there's kind of two little adjacent wings on either side. And so they transform them. So even the shape of the church is testifying to their theology. And that's why many older churches, I don't know if you guys have noticed this, a lot of older churches are long. A lot of modern churches, they're more like stadium style, right? They're wider. But the older churches are longer like that for a reason, including like Darby. Like it's if you're at the for as small as our sanctuary is, when you're in the back, you're like way in the back. You're really far removed because of how long the church is. That goes all the way back to these early Christian basilicas that do it in this now shape of a cross. And they filled these churches with beautiful art. And this Roman style and this Roman art, this would actually pave the way for the beautiful cathedrals and artwork that we see in medieval Christianity. Another great thing that Constantine did is he founded a city called Constantinople. Now, we won't go into the whole background of Constantinople. You can read the notes on there. But basically, so funny, he named it after himself. Seems a little cocky, but that was pretty common for rulers to do. There's like 5 cities called Alexandria that Alexander the Great named after himself. But Constantinople was actually in the eastern side of the Roman Empire. And when we talk about Rome falling, which we'll talk about in the year 410, what a lot of people don't realize is that that was the western side of the Roman Empire that fell in 410. The eastern side of the empire, which had Constantinople as its capital, actually went on to thrive for another 1,000 years. And Constantinople was an absolute haven of Christian study, of Christian libraries, of Christian art, of Christian architecture, of Christian culture. Some of the most beautiful churches were there. Some of the greatest Christian thinkers were there. What Athens was to ancient Greece, Constantinople was to ancient Christianity. And that was Constantine's dream for sort of this Christian Disney world almost. And it would stand again for another 1,000 years until it fell to the Turks in 1453. The other thing he did is he paved the way for Christian rulers to come. Throughout the medieval period, we're going to see a lot of different kings and queens, and they are under the assumption that, of course, as a king or queen, I rule for the glory of Jesus. But Constantine was the very first. And this is why I'm willing to give Constantine a little bit of grace, because there were 0 Christian rulers before him to look to and say, how should I do this? He was the trendsetter in every way imaginable. So if Constantine gets something wrong, he had no precedent beforehand to be able to look at. So this would pave the way for the medieval notion of a king ruling over a Christian nation. Now, we conclude this first section by saying maybe we can give some grace where Constantine's rule is less than ideal. But if nothing else, we can be appreciative of the fact that God used this to begin changing the tide in world history a little bit. So that was Constantine. Let's go on to section number 2 and consider the fall of Rome. Now, after the conversion of Constantine, Christianity continues to play a very important role. Sometime after Constantine, there was an emperor by the name of Julian the Apostate. He was called the Apostate because he was also raised as a Christian, but he went back on it and said, I like the old Roman gods better. Why did we ever get rid of Roman paganism? And so he actually went back, tried to eradicate Christianity from the Roman Empire. He started to headhunt Christians again and tried to get rid of it, but he found that he couldn't. The damage had been done and there was no reversing it. And so he very famously on his deathbed, as his mission in life was to reverse what Constantine had done. And he found that he couldn't do it. And so on his deathbed, Julian famously said, "Thou hast conquered, O Galilean." In other words, Jesus won, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. Another famous guy was named Telemachus. He was a monk who in the early 400s helped put an end to the gladiator games. The gladiators were actually, now Constantine had clamped down on some of the restrictions about gladiators, but hadn't totally put them to an end. In the early 400s, I think it was the year 404, but I could be wrong. There was a gladiator game going on, and this monk, Telemachus, is horrified, and he runs out in the arena pleading with the people to stop doing this. And in the fray, Telemachus himself gets cut down in the arena. And this moved the crowd and the emperor present so strongly that the emperor actually banished the gladiator games, and they have never emerged again, except for in Ridley Scott movies. So we see Christians continuing to play this role in the Roman Empire. However, by this point, the Roman Empire had become so internally corrupted. There was so much rot going on. Its senators and its politicians were corrupt. It said that I think it was what was it? A good portion of the Roman Empire was actually slaves. I can't remember the statistic, but it was a very large statistic of the Roman Empire actually consisted of slaves. And with so many slaves, there was less work for other people to do. So a lot of Romans ended up becoming quite lazy because the slaves were doing everything. And the politicians didn't want them getting involved in politics because they wanted to keep their little corruption going. So what do? You entertain them with bread and circuses. And so the people were used to just dumb entertainment, a lot like today. And so the Roman populace had become very fat, lazy, and dumbed down. They were very hedonistic. Now, the emperor could legislate Christian laws, and that was great, but he couldn't change hearts. So on top of that, the Roman reign over the nations had been so big, they were beginning to lose power. They couldn't maintain all the countries they had control over. Some of those countries were getting a little sick of being occupied by the Romans. And so they start being ready to push back a little bit. So you take all these ingredients and you put them together, and you're setting yourself up for the fall. So in the year 410, the unthinkable happened. The weakened city of Rome was invaded and conquered, led by a king named Alaric I. He led his Visigoth army. He had actually served as a Roman soldier at one point, so he was very familiar with how Rome worked, how their military worked. But he leads this Visigoth army, and he sacks Rome. This was big. This was the first time in 800 years that a foreign army successfully invaded the city. Think about it. Nearly a millennium of white marble halls and regal Senate meetings, of grand Caesars and their imperial splendor, of armies that marched across the earth and conquered everything, of the lavish architecture, music, art, feasting, and games of a Roman civilization that was unlike anything the world has ever seen, and to some degree, the world still has not seen since. You know that whole thing you hear about how men are always thinking about the Roman Empire? It's true, because there's never been anything quite like it. And yet, it's fallen. And it's hard to really overstate the importance that this played, or to overstate the discombobulation that this caused. People basically didn't know what to do with themselves when Rome fell. Not only had it been the most dominant force in the world for so long, but Rome had provided stability in civilization. It had provided a collective sense of identity that people shared. Remember, Rome had been called the eternal city. It stood for the ultimate human ideal. Rome was like the peak of basically the evolution of civilization. Rome was the eternal future. And not only had the pagan Romans wrapped up all their stock in the city, but remember, the Christians had begun to do so too, because the Roman emperors were Christians now. And so the Christians began to think the hope of the kingdom of God on earth is wrapped up with the Roman Empire. So it was the ultimate contradiction that the eternal city had come to an end. And so for both pagan and Christian alike, this felt kind of like the end of the world. Where do we go from here? Who could provide stability? Who could provide that shared sense of identity and purpose? All these nations across the world, they had been united in this ideal that was Rome. What ideal could possibly bring all of these diverse people groups together again? Who could provide the religious, the political, and the societal context for civilization to thrive? Who could provide this transcendent ideal that men would be willing to work and die for? Rome left a huge gap, and it was a gap that would be fulfilled by the Christian church. Into this massive void steps the church. And when I say the church, I don't simply mean a Christian emperor. I mean the ecclesiastical structure of the church, with its bishops and its presbyters and its deacons and its monks. In the years that followed, the people looked to the church to fill that gap and to provide the same stability that Rome had provided. And there's many reasons why people naturally gravitated towards the church, and we'll highlight just a few. A lot of Romans were already familiar with Christianity. It originated within the Roman Empire. They had a long history in the Roman Empire, and in very recent years, the emperors had become Christians. So in this, if you think about, if the fall of Rome provided this tumultuous upheaval, everything was changing, all the old systems were broken, everything was falling apart, Christianity kind of was like a semblance of the good old days. Secondly, one of the reasons why so many were drawn to the ideal of Rome is that it was this transcendent divine kingdom that eclipsed but incorporated all other kingdoms within it. Well, the church offered something very similar in the kingdom of God. But this kingdom was clearly superior to Rome. For not only had the martyrs and saints overcome Rome through their testimony and their death, not only had the emperors become subject to Christ, but the kingdom of God was still standing when the kingdom of Caesar had fallen. So if Rome had been admired for its transcendent power, the church was now admired even more so. Another reason is that the governance of the church had actually come to resemble the Roman Empire somewhat similarly, so that people actually felt very natural to transfer kind of your allegiance to the church. So there's a couple different ways. First of all, the Bishop of Rome, who had come to be known as the Pope, and the word Pope just comes from the word Papa, which means father. We have already talked about how he had come to be revered amongst all the different bishops. So that means that this leader of the bishops is headquartered in the city of Rome. Striking similarity to the way that the father of the Roman people, you might say, had also been headquartered in Rome. So people immediately saw these parallels between the emperor ruling in Rome and now the Pope or the Bishop of Rome ruling in that city. And the way that the bishops would preside over certain regions as an extension of the Pope's reign was very similar to how the Roman governors had reigned over regions, sort of answering back to the Roman emperor. So the people were very used to this structure. That's why the Roman Catholic Church has the word Roman in there, because it was centered in Rome. And for a lot of people, yeah, it feels like sort of this religious continuation of what the Roman government had been doing. Many of the church leaders also began to take on political roles in this time. Now, before we start dismissing or criticizing that, we have to remember, after Rome falls, all civil order collapses. So with just the barbarians storming in and chaos reigning everywhere, who ensures public virtue? Who settles disputes when neighbors get into fights about property lines? Who ensures that the rights of the marginalized are being upheld? Who offers protection from the barbarian marauders going around hurting people? There was no stable government to look to for these matters. So people looked to the next strongest institution around, which was the church. Now, here's another thing. When it came to religious matters, many Romans had been used to the system of polytheism, in which specific deities presided over certain areas of life. So you had the god or goddess of the crops, of the rain, of fertility, of healing, that sort of thing. And so shrines and prayers would be offered up to these polytheistic deities to try to solicit their favor in this particular area of their power. Now, the concept of a patron saint began to feel somewhat similar. Now, very early on, it's true that the Christians revered their martyrs and their saints. I don't think there's anything wrong with commemorating and honoring the saints. When you talk about these certain saint days or whatever, I think as long as you're not, worshiping those saints, there's nothing wrong with remembering that. The church was doing that from a very early time, including the church would also build memorials to remember these saints. But over time, that practice of memorial began to evolve a little bit. Eventually, you come up to this idea of a patron saint. And the idea of a patron saint was that the particular holy men or women who had died, they were now glorified in heaven. All right, good so far. But they were now advocates of particular virtues, places, or groups, usually one that they had been kind of affiliated with on earth. And since those saints had faithfully won their race, and they were now standing in glory before the face of God, they have kind of been in with God that you and I don't while we're here on earth. So the idea comes up, here's this saint who practiced courage, or this saint, who did evangelism or something like that. And so this saint is as a proven authority in this area. That saint is in front of God right now. If I ask that saint for help with my own courage or with sharing the gospel, that saint can put in a good word with me or a good word for me with God. And so this idea of patron saints developed. Now, this practice is not strictly polytheistic, but you can see how it strongly resembled some of the polytheistic practices of the Romans. Oh, I have this powerful being who is in charge of the crops. I pray to this god of the crops and it helps out with my crops. Oh, you've got a patron saint of the crops. And I ask this patron saint for help. Great. So you can see how that provided a bit of a natural transition as well. Some of the previous Roman pagans were more accepting of it. Now, a really important topic in all this is the emerging preeminence of the Pope. We've already seen the Bishop of Rome was looked to by the other churches. He was a model bishop. He was this upholder of orthodoxy. The church at Rome was considered a model church. It certainly had a lot of historical precedent behind it. There were some great leaders who had come out of Rome. The bishop in Rome inherited this noble ministry. Great. Although there was no formal Roman Catholic ecclesiology, there's no doubt that the church and the bishop of Rome played a prominent role. Now, once the Roman Empire collapses, that prominent role becomes a little bit more official. Two prominent figures played a big hand in this. The first is known as Pope Leo I, and the next is Pope Gregory I. They are also called Leo the Great or Gregory the Great. Now, what they did is they dramatically expanded papal power. And they advanced it through this argument that Peter, who they would say Peter was the Bishop of Rome, right? Well, that's what the Pope is, the Bishop of Rome. So the Bishop of Rome stands in this authoritative line going all the way back to Peter himself. So whatever authority Peter had in the church, that has been passed down to each Bishop of Rome, including me. Now, Protestants may disagree with that expansion of papal power. We would see that as a negative thing. But to be fair to Leo and Gregory, we should understand the historical context in which they're doing this. When you read their works and what they did, even if we think it was incorrect, they seem to have done so in a genuinely fatherly attempt to help the church and the nations after the empire fell. Basically, they recognized the world is in chaos. People need a source of stability. They're kind of looking to Rome still, not the government of Rome, but the church of Rome. I have to basically step up and be a father to these people. And so the idea of Pope, Papa, Father comes along. They were also, and these guys were strongly Orthodox. They were big advocates of the Trinity and fighting against the heresies such as Arianism. So just as the Roman emperor had been kind of a father to his people, now the Roman bishop became sort of a father to the church. Now, with this transition of power from Rome to the church, we might say the triumph of Christ over Caesar was complete. The age of the Roman Empire had officially ended. The age of Christendom was beginning. Now, we'll go ahead. It's 8:11. We'll go ahead and we'll pause. We'll take our break for about 5-10 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the figure known as Augustine of Hippo. All right, everybody, go ahead and resume your seats. We are on page 9, talking about Augustine or Augustine, depending on who you talk to. Augustine. See, I hear a lot of people say Augustine, but then when I talk about going on vacation, I go to St. Augustine. So it's like, or like the grass is St. Augustine. Yeah. All right. Page 9. Now, during this whole period of the fall of Rome and then the church becoming a really preeminent institution, there is a figure who stands out very much during this time, and that is Augustine of Hippo. And not just through this period, but really through all the ages. It is very hard to find a figure that both Roman Catholics and Protestants really admire. And yet he is such a man. He's also someone who, if you are talking, even if you're talking to secular historians, theologians, or philosophers, the name of Augustine will come up because he has so dramatically influenced Western thought, you really can't get away from him. Now, one of the other things that makes him so accessible to us is that many of the church fathers, a lot of their writings have been lost. We have a couple key ones. I've mentioned some in class, but the church fathers didn't just write like 1 or 2 books each. They wrote a whole bunch of stuff, but they've been lost to time. Well, Augustine has had most of his stuff preserved. He's written hundreds and hundreds of books and sermons and commentaries and letters, and a lot of them have been preserved. And he's known for taking the Greco-Roman classical style, and he writes all kinds of stuff. He writes theology, he writes philosophy, he writes social commentary. He's done tons of Bible commentaries. He even did an entire volume explaining the supposed discrepancies between the four gospels. He went like point for point on all the different things the gospels supposedly contradicted each other, and he showed how no, they actually are quite harmonious. Now, I want to talk for a couple minutes about some of Augustine's most important works and contributions. For our purposes, the biggest one to consider is City of God. This is a giant volume, and it's kind of several things at once. It's theology, it's history, and it's social commentary all wrapped up into one. The reason why Augustine wrote the City of God, kind of touched on it already, is after the Roman Empire falls, people wonder what's going to happen next. It's kind of like an end of the world scenario. All of our stability and security is gone. And remember, that was not just the pagans, it was the Christians as well. The fall of Rome means the fall of civilization and the future of mankind. But in City of God, Augustine writes a very, very important thesis, basically. And that is you could break down all of human history into two cities. There's the city of God, which is marked by truth and righteousness. It cannot be isolatedly synonymous with any particular man-made government or nation. It is a spiritual, heavenly entity that has been manifest and has been seen to the kingdoms of the world, but the kingdom of God, the city of God, is ultimately a heavenly entity. And you cannot reduce it to a physical nation. Then there's the city of man. The city of man is marked by rebellion against God and a thirst for the glory that only rightfully belongs to him. This is basically the creature's attempt to usurp the creator. And this is also seen in many nations of the earth. And so what Augustine does is he goes all the way back to the beginning of time. He goes back to Genesis and he charts sort of this chronicle of history all the way up to the present day, showing how these two cities have been at odds with each other. The reign of God, marked by God's glory and righteousness, which is the city of God that's from heaven and is manifest on earth, but then the city of man, which is rebellious man trying to basically take the reins from God. And he shows going all the way back to Eve and the serpent, and Cain and Abel, and Noah and his neighbors, and the Tower of Babel, and Nebuchadnezzar, and the Medes and the Persians, and Alexander the Great, and the Roman emperors, and all these times where the city of man set itself up against the kingdom of God. And his reason for doing this was to say, listen, the kingdom of man comes and goes. The cities topple. The reigns come to an end. The buildings crumble. The thrones are torn down. The crowns are broken. The genealogical lines of these kings come to an end. But it is the city of God, our heavenly abode, that will never come to an end. And even though Rome may have fallen, the city of God is still standing strong. And so if you were not a Christian, he was telling you, hey, you know what? It's a shame that Rome fell, but put your trust in the true king of the true and lasting city. And if you were a Christian, be of good cheer and be of heart, because your king's kingdom is still standing. Perhaps his most famous work was called Confessions. Confessions is a bit of a unique hybrid. I don't know what genre you would put it under, because it's like his own personal testimony, but at times it reads like a morning devotional. Sometimes it feels like a prayer journal. At other times, it's like this deep theological commentary, and sometimes it's like these brain-scratching philosophical musings. And Augustine brilliantly combines all of these into one. The point of Confessions is he's basically chronicling his journey from being a hedonistic youth to experimenting with the Manichaean, which was a semi-Gnostic sort of cult religion, to then being saved radically by God's unconditional divine grace. And so what Augustine highlights in this story is a couple things. First of all, the innate natural depravity of man, how we are sinners by nature. This was a doctrine that Augustine is very famous for, called original sin. It comes originally with you. Sin is not something that you have to learn or that gets gets handed to you after you're born. It's something you're born with. You have a corrupt seed within you when you're born. As an example, he uses a story from his childhood, how him and some buddies stole a pear from someone's garden. And he said, I wasn't hungry. We were rich. I wasn't lacking for food. In fact, the pears in my father's garden were way better than this. So why did I do it? Just for the thrill of it. Just because I felt edgy when I did something that I knew I wasn't supposed to do. And he uses this as an example of innate human sinfulness. But then as he chronicles the story, he shows how God was very slowly and meticulously sort of pecking away at Augustine. And God would put these characters and these figures in his life that were sort of laying the foundation that would eventually lead to Augustine accepting Christ. And this finally happens years later. Augustine says he's in a garden and he hears it sounds like a child singing, and it's like the verse from like a nursery rhyme. It sounds like a child singing a nursery rhyme, and it says, "Take up and read, take up and read, take up and read," and it's just like a goofy kid song. But he takes it seriously, and in front of him happened to be a Bible, and he picks it up and he opens to the Gospel of Matthew, and it hits him like a ton of bricks. And he says, at that moment, basically, God converted my soul, and I went from being dead to alive, what we would call regeneration. Now, leading up to this process, he talks a lot about his mother, Monica. She was a Christian woman who had been praying for him the whole time. He talked about the work of the church father Ambrose, whose preaching Augustine really, really admired. Augustine was an intellectual, and so he wanted preaching that could be intelligent. And Ambrose, Augustine was really wowed by how Ambrose talked about these spiritual truths in a very intelligent way. These were all figures that God used to lay the foundation. But Augustine's point was, my salvation was the sovereign act of God. God intervened, and God broke my hardened heart, and God saved me even when I wasn't interested in being saved. And so Augustine would become a prominent proponent of divine sovereignty in salvation. And that led him to a very famous conflict with a guy named Pelagius. So most of you are familiar with the debate between the Calvinists and the Arminians. And you've got John Calvin and Jacob Arminius, and it's the argument about predestination and free will. Well, 1,000 years before Calvin and Arminius, there was Augustine and Pelagius. They were arguing about predestination before it was cool. Now, Augustine's theology was marked by an emphasis on, again, human depravity, and his thing was that because we are so depraved and our hearts are so naturally hardened, we cannot, of our own natural ability, positively respond to God's offer of the gospel. God must first intervene and change our hearts so that we can respond. Man in his own ability will not respond to God's offer unless God changes his heart first. And Augustine said this would be done to those whom God had predestined. By contrast, Pelagius went in the opposite direction and said, no, man is actually not born sinful. Man is basically born into the same state as Adam and Eve. They're neutral. They could sin or they could not sin. It's totally up to your own choice. Pelagius said, we do not receive a sinful nature from Adam. All we do is follow his bad example. Therefore, man can obey God without needing grace to make it happen. Pelagius said, you have the ability within yourself to obey God's law, to respond to the gospel based on your own strength. You just have to choose to do the right thing. It is, you don't need divine assistance. It's purely a matter of your choice. And Augustine was very adamant that Pelagius's position undermined the need for grace and the gospel itself. And so even after they died, this debate continued until 529. There was what's called the Second Council of Orange. And the church didn't affirm every nuance of Augustine's theology. They maybe weren't comfortable with some of his views on predestination, but they did affirm that man has a sinful nature and that divine grace must first do a work in a person's heart before they can respond to the gospel. So the church did agree with Augustine there, and they rejected Pelagius's views that man is born morally neutral. So I put a quote there from Canon 7 of the Council of Orange. You can read their decision there. Now, why is Augustine so important? Because in an age of empire-wide upheaval, he reminded them of the lasting city of God. In an age where the church moved into this new role of stability and leadership, Augustine helped pioneer its thinking. In an age when the gospel was being undermined by claims of human goodness, Augustine protected the doctrines of grace. So you may love him, you may hate him, you agree with him on some things, disagree with him on others, but there's no denying he played a massive role in helping to develop and preserve the church during this time. All right. Any questions about Augustine before we move on to section 3? Talk about the early monks. All right. So we're going to start by talking about a guy named Anthony the Great and the Desert Fathers. Now, today, there's estimated to be about 4,000 Christian monasteries around the world. And yet, the guy who was kind of responsible for this movement had no intention of starting a movement at all. If you were to ask Anthony the Great, guess how many monasteries there are in the world, he would have been shocked probably that there were any. Anthony was not really concerned with starting monasteries. He was more concerned about his own individual spiritual self-discipline. And because he was so insistent on that, others sort of caught that fire. And therefore, Christian monasticism was basically born. There had been other monks prior to Anthony, but no one nearly of that same caliber. There was no system, there was no organization, there were no monasteries. It was kind of just random guys going off in caves. But St. Anthony kind of made it trendy and cool to be a monk. So he lived from 251 to 356, and you read that right. He didn't die till he was 105 years old. Now, him and other guys like him were known as the Desert Fathers. A lot of them were from Egypt or for the area right around Egypt. And so they retreated into the wilderness to live a life of seclusion, and that was the Egyptian desert. And so they became known as the Desert Fathers. There were also women who did something similar. They were nuns who became known as the Desert Mothers. Now, little background on Anthony. When he was about 20, he inherited a good bit of property and wealth from his parents. They had died. But he also was very convicted by a sermon he heard, in which he heard Christ's words to the rich young ruler, "Sell all you have and give it to the poor." This really hit Anthony hard. And so what he decided to do was give his land to his neighbors. He distributed it between them. He sold all his possessions, and every penny he made off of it, he gave to the poor that lived nearby. He began sleeping on the ground. He ate only bread and water, and just once a day. And it was said that for 12 years, he was tormented by various demons who would spiritually and physically assault him. Supposedly, people would come and they would find Anthony all beat up because these demons would attack him. Even if that wasn't true, it's probably pretty certain that he definitely wrestled spiritually. And he said that he constantly faced these allurements and these temptations to pursue a life of wealth, comfort, and pleasure. And so Anthony really becomes this picturesque figure in the Christian mind of what the battle with the flesh looks like. What does it mean to say no to the flesh and give up our desires and lusts? And so Anthony wrestling with demons in the wilderness has become a very relatable picture for a Christian. If you've ever been in a season where you feel like you're in a bit of a wasteland and you're just tormented by the desires of your own flesh, there's some beautiful artwork of Anthony like WWEing it with demons. And you're like, that's exactly what I've looked like on the inside before. And so he becomes a very relatable figure. Now, for a while, he lives in tombs and caves, and then he spends 20 years, he takes up residency in an abandoned fort, and he lives there by himself. Anthony's solution was basically totally remove myself from everyone and everything. But God wouldn't let that happen. He could not be a total hermit because so many people were inspired by his self-denial that they came seeking his help on how they too could live a life of self-denial. So a lot of people would set up like tents and camps outside of this abandoned fort. Like, Anthony, come on, we just want you to, you can go be a hermit afterwards, but tell us how we can be good hermits too. And so quite a large following clustered around Anthony. And so against his own desires, he ended up becoming a bit of a teacher. And he taught people how to fast, how to pray, how to give generously. Well, then in 311, just before Constantine comes around, the Emperor Maximian leads one of the most severe Christian persecutions up until that time. Now, Anthony, when he hears these Christians are all getting killed, he thinks, oh, this is my chance. I'm going to go die a martyr's death. I'm going to go out in a blaze of glory. And so he comes out of seclusion thinking, I'm going to go die for Christ. But he doesn't. Instead, he ends up, again, sort of against his own will, ends up helping other Christians who had been beaten and tortured in this persecution. And so I think God taught him a very important lesson. Instead of suffering martyrdom, Anthony ended up taking care of other Christians who were undergoing martyrdom. And so Anthony, I think, learns here genuine self-denial doesn't simply mean removing yourself from all people, but oftentimes it's laying down yourself in order to serve other people. Now, not only did he learn self-discipline and self-sacrificial love, but he also was very zealous about sound doctrine as well. So once again, he wants to try to be a hermit, and something comes up that doesn't let him. So in the early 300s, we talked about how Arianism was spreading, this doctrine that Jesus was not God the Son. He was a created being who what was it, was a creature, right, who was not God. And when Anthony hears about this, he gets kind of riled up. And so once again, kind of against, he's like, all right, someone's got to do something to stand against Arianism. So once again, he comes out of recluse mode and he goes out and he starts having theological battles in the city of Alexandria, which is where Arianism had developed a really strong foothold. And he starts doing theological battles, preaching on the doctrine of the Trinity. And Anthony gains such a strong reputation for his self-denial, but also for his orthodoxy, that Emperor Constantine actually writes him a letter and actually wants to get some of the monks' counsel. Now, Anthony, wanting to live this segregated life, doesn't really care much about politics at all. So he gets a letter from Constantine, and his monk buddies are all like, Anthony, you just got a letter from the emperor. And he goes, so? I have no desire to get involved in politics. Big deal. But they encouraged him, like, dude, Constantine is a Christian. He's gonna really help the church. You've got to respond to this. He's like, fine, correspond with the emperor. So he writes back to him, and he basically has no problem telling Constantine, hey, whatever you do, don't be a stupid, corrupt ruler. Like, don't let the power go to your head. Stay humble, right? If you want to learn anything from me, it's that, don't think too highly of yourself. And rather than die as a martyr, Anthony ends up living to the ripe old age of 105. And before he dies, he actually requests that his burial be kept a secret because he didn't want his fanboys creating this cult or this shrine over his grave. Now, they ended up making cultic shrines to him anyway, but just in other places. They weren't sure where his burial was. So this is a guy who, if nothing else, did not want fame and attention, and yet got it anyway. And Athanasius, our buddy, who we read about last week, who famously stood up to the Arians as well, he was a big fan of Anthony, and he wrote one of the most well-known sources we have about Anthony called The Life of Anthony. Now, this monk's life was marked by strict asceticism, self-denial, coupled with this reminder that Christ intends his people to be salt and light in the church and in the world. So the faithful Christian may be reclusive at times, but he can never be totally reclusive. In other words, if I'm really to serve Christ, I can't just bottle myself away in the wilderness somewhere. People are going to want instruction. They're going to want help. There's going to be affairs of the world you have to raise your voice in. There's doctrine that needs to be taught. There's people who need assistance. And so Anthony kind of had to learn that. Now, although the first desert fathers sought absolute isolation, this clearly was not an option, as we've seen in the life of St. Anthony. It's really hard to maintain a faithful Christian witness if you're just bottled up somewhere. So eventually, now that didn't make the idea of monasticism go away. It just got reinvented a little bit. So you have groups of people who share these ideals. They want to commit to a life of poverty. They want to live simply. They want to live a life of asceticism. They want to spend a lot of time in deep, prayerful study. And these guys, instead of taking up their own cave hundreds of miles apart, they begin to cluster together and form communities. And these communities became known as monasteries. And this provided accountability, fellowship, and even more effective ministry. The male monasteries were led by a guy named an abbot, and they were, of course, monks. And then the female monasteries were led by an abbess, and they were, of course, the nuns. And they were marked by a very diligent schedule of reading, prayer, physical labor, and helping others. As we'll see 2 lectures from now, monasteries would actually become one of the greatest sources of good in the Middle Ages. Now, as these groups of monks begin to grow and they begin living together, if you've ever stayed with more than a couple people for a couple nights, you realize ground rules are in order. Like I remember serving as a camp counselor at a youth retreat, and you're in this cabin with a bunch of people, and you're like, guys, listen, before we start, we need some ground rules so everybody knows what's what. Well, questions like, well, who's in charge of this place? What should our daily routine look like? How should we divvy up the work? Into this equation steps a guy named Saint Benedict. He lived at the end of the 5th, beginning of the 6th century. He was an Italian monk, and he is often credited with founding Western monasticism. If Anthony was sort of the father of monasticism in general, Benedict was the father of Western monasticism and the idea of the monastery. He wrote a book of 73 chapters called The Rules of St. Benedict, and it's very specific rules for how these monasteries were to be operated. It covers everything from the moral character that the abbots and monks were to exhibit, what your daily calendar would look like, what sleeping arrangements looks like, how did the kitchen operate, how do you care for the elderly and the sick, things like that. Now, as you read through Benedict's rules, a couple things might strike you. One is that there is an incredible attention to detail, and it's highly organized. It's very well structured. And yet, when you read it, it is deep in piety and humility. That's a constant emphasis, is that these abbots and these monks, hey, you're doing this great spiritual thing. Don't let it go to your head. Every time someone begins to do a job that might make them feel good about themselves, you get this accountable whack over the head reminding you of how humble you're supposed to be. There's also a lot of scripture quoted in the rules of St. Benedict as well. And there's a reason why this Benedictine order that he started is actually still a strong force today, because it combines rigor and spirituality. And so I give you some examples there. We don't have time to read through all of those, but these are just some examples from the rules of St. Benedict about how the abbots should operate, what your lifestyle should look like, prayer, sleeping arrangements, reading during mealtime, your routines on receiving gifts, things like that. So go back and read some of those. You can also read this for free online. All right. What's an assessment of early monasticism? Were the monks a positive thing or a negative thing for the church? Kind of like with Constantine, we should take a nuanced view and we should recognize the negatives and the positives. Some of the negatives were that it was basically functional Gnosticism in some instances. Now, from a doctrinal perspective, these monks would have radically disagreed with the Gnostics. But if you look at the way they lived, you would sometimes assume that these monks seemed to think that matter was bad. Almost like there's like this stigma against eating good food or laughing, or these things that you do in the body were almost seen as undisciplined acts of the flesh. And so even though they would have disagreed with the Gnostics, they kind of acted like Gnosticism was true sometimes. Some of them would also practice escapism. Escapism is where you try to retreat from problems rather than deal with them. And so certainly the early desert monks, it's good that they would abstain from sinful activities, but it could also basically just trying to escape from the world rather than trying to be redemptive salt and light in the world. Another big problem is that there was an absence from the local church. It's very important. We see it in scripture. We saw it in the early church. Christians assemble on the Lord's day to pray, sing, teach, learn, give, serve, and take the Lord's Supper together. And yet, if you're an isolated monastic living out in a cave somewhere, you're not getting that. Now, it might sound really spiritual to say, I'm going to go live off by myself somewhere, but what is more spiritual than following the commands of Jesus to cultivate your spiritual life, right? You're not more spiritual than Jesus. So Jesus prescribes as a normal affair for the Christian, the gathering with the body of Christ. So these monks would often deprive themselves of that, at least earlier on. Here's some positives, though. It was a needed reaction against soft Christianity. So the monks were sort of the new martyrs post-Constantine. During the long years of Christian martyrdom, remember, believers would have to sometimes quite literally take up their cross and follow Jesus. To be a disciple actually cost you something. But once Christianity becomes legal, it could bring in illegitimate disciples, maybe for the wrong reasons, or it would promote lukewarmness in Christians. And so as a result, Christianity became a little comfortable. And so it lost some of the selfless, sacrificial potency that had marked it during its early years. Some Christians got fat and lazy in their newfound freedom, and they began resembling the hedonistic Roman society, the same society that had once persecuted them. So there was this desire amongst Christians to recapture that radical devotion that marked the early church. Hey, remember the early martyrs? Remember how they were willing to give up the whole world to follow Jesus? We don't really get an opportunity to do that anymore because we're not being martyred. How do we recapture that? Well, if Rome won't persecute me, I'll persecute myself. Now, They wouldn't put it quite in those words, but this was basically showing they had not just a willingness, but a desire to give up everything for Christ. They longed to be able to give up everything for Jesus. Even if there's nuances there we don't agree with, we have to at least admire their longing to lay down everything for Jesus. Humility is another one. A third is communion with God. At the heart of monasticism is this ideal of getting to God. Communion with God is the goal and the highest delight of existence. So when these monks practiced asceticism, you have to realize they were not simply saying, no to good stuff. They thought that this stuff was a distraction from the ultimate good. God is the highest delight. God is the highest joy. And when they say no to all this other stuff, they're saying, I don't want anything to get in my way to distract from this communion with God. And so the ultimate aim of monasticism was love and fellowship with God. But then the fourth good thing to come from this was the monasteries themselves. We've already said this individualistic isolationism could be problematic, but thankfully monasticism didn't continue in that vein. Instead, they gathered into their monasteries. And over the medieval period, these monasteries would go on to become one of the greatest forces of good in the world. It was in the monasteries that there was learning, kindness, provision, and stability. They lived in these places called abbeys. And in the abbeys, there were libraries where they preserved many of the ancient writings. They would have schools there at the abbeys. They would provide education. They would administer medical care to the sick. They would open doors free of charge to any travelers. They would create their own little ecosystem by cultivating crops and gardens. And when the local village would undergo a famine, the abbeys would be able to feed everybody. In fact, as we'll see in 2 weeks, the whole idea of a college or university was actually came about because the monasteries started schools, and that's what would become the university. So we can look at what the monasteries became and what they did, and we can praise God for that. All right, fourth and final section is the missionaries. We're not going to have time to cover this too in depth. We always run short on time. So as always, I'm going to encourage you to go back and read through this very, very carefully, because I love the stories of the missionaries. I should have done it first, just so I could make sure that we cover it all. The first missionary that we would look at would be St. Patrick. He was called the Apostle to the Irish. Now, Patrick, even though we affiliate him with Ireland, he was actually born on Great Britain. So there's a sea that divides Ireland, the island, from Great Britain. Now, Patrick was born into a Christian family, but he was kind of skeptical. His dad was actually a deacon, and he was actually skeptical of Christianity. He wasn't quite sure if he bought into it or not. But when he was 16 years old, and he actually wrote his own book called Confessions, like Augustine, where he also gives us his own autobiography. And he tells us that when he was 16 years old, a band of pirates basically raided his village, took him captive, took him across the sea there, and sold him as a slave in Ireland. And as he was there, he's faced with an existential crisis. He's away from his home, he's somebody's property, and that kind of forces him to reevaluate his faith in Christianity. And he ends up concluding that the God of Christianity is the true God, and he cries out to Jesus to save him. And Patrick speaks of that experience as what God actually used to bring him to Christ. Now, a couple years later, Patrick, I think it's 6 years later, Patrick has the opportunity to actually sneak aboard a ship and get back home to Britain. He comes back home, joyful homecoming, life can resume as usual. Patrick begins getting involved in ministry, but as he tries to go back to normal life, he can't shake this nagging feeling that, man, those Celtic pagans in Ireland really need Jesus. And he talks about a dream that he had one night where an Irishman named Victoricus brings him a letter that's called The Voice of the Irish. And the voice of the Irish are crying out, "We beg you, come and walk among us again." And Patrick says this really pierces him to the heart. And so he decides to return to the very place where he had been a slave and bring the gospel. Now, Ireland at the time was deeply rooted in a Celtic religion known as Druidism. Druidism was a bit of nature worship. It connected it emphasized sort of the connected living essence of all things that were bound together, very new agey. And the Druid priests were very highly regarded in their communities. They would meet at sort of these Stonehenge circle types of places. They would conduct their odd rituals. One of their rituals involved even human sacrifice. If you ever saw the old classic movie The Wicker Man, 1973, and then a hilarious remake with Nicolas Cage, but it wasn't intended to be hilarious. It basically is this group of this community of Celtic witches who take a guy, they stick him in this giant man made out of wicker filled with animals, and then they set it on fire while he's still alive. And that wasn't just a horror movie trope, that's a real practice that these Celts would do. So Patrick is facing that possibility when he goes back here. Now, at first, he faces some resistance. He's often in danger. At times, he was even beaten and imprisoned, and yet he continued to preach the Trinity and the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it took time, but eventually it began flourishing. And Patrick would be able to write years later that thousands of people were converted and were being baptized. Many were even becoming monks and nuns. He was planting churches, he was planting monasteries, and for the rest of Ireland's history, to this very day, Christianity has played a huge role in its culture. Now, there's one famous legend that says he drove all the serpents out of Ireland. There's no evidence that snakes ever existed on Ireland, but I think this is probably like a spiritual allegory. You know, the devil is pictured as a serpent, and so I think it's very fitting that he's basically driving the devil out of Ireland. Now, it was customary for churches to honor saints and martyrs on the day of their death. And Patrick died on March 17th, which has been forever enshrined as St. Patrick's Day. But I think it's really funny to point out to people that when everybody's wearing green and getting drunk, that, hey, you know, St. Patrick's Day actually has nothing to do with leprechauns or clovers or anything like that. It's actually about God's grace in the life of a rebel, the power of the gospel to overpower paganism, and the conversion of the nations to Jesus Christ, and a faulty but well-intentioned analogy of the Trinity with the three-leaf clover there. I would encourage you to go back and read there. There's a very famous prayer by Patrick called the Breastplate Prayer of Protection. This is a prayer that he wrote and used when he was doing his work and was facing danger on all sides. And it's a bit of a longer prayer, but it's a very beautiful prayer. And I'll just read the first part there. He says, I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity, through belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness of the creator of creation. I arise today through the strength of Christ's birth with his baptism, through the strength of his crucifixion with his burial, through the strength of his resurrection with his ascension, through the strength of his descent for the judgment of doom. You know what I love about this? He's basically praying through all the major movements of the gospel, but also of the creed as well, isn't it? And he's going through these movements of it. And he's basically praying it, saying, this is my strength. And then at the end of the prayer, he famously says, Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. This is a great prayer to incorporate into your own devotional life. All right, two more guys. We'll try to wrap this up. The next one is St. Augustine. Now, this is not to be confused with the Augustine we talked about earlier. There's actually two Augustines. The earlier one was Augustine of Hippo. This is Augustine of Canterbury, who lived sometime later. What Patrick was to the Irish, Augustine of Canterbury was to the English. Now, go back and read a little bit more about him. We don't really have time to get to the historical backdrop there. But basically what it comes down to is the Angles and the Saxons had invaded Britain and brought paganism with them. And Pope Gregory the Great, we talked about him earlier, he sees this great evangelistic need in England. And he asks this monk named Augustine to lead the charge. It would have been very dangerous, and because it was already torn by war. And on top of that, if you go into this war-torn area and you start telling them your gods are a bunch of phonies, you should repent and believe in the Trinity, then you're putting your life at serious risk. And yet Augustine bravely agrees to do it. And he goes first to King Ethelbert of Kent. Now, this was a very smart decision, because if you can get to the king, it'll give you an open door to the rest of the people. But secondly, Ethelbert's wife was already a Christian. So maybe he wasn't a Christian, but maybe he's somewhat sensitive to it. And it's a very famous meeting. So Ethelbert, he doesn't know too much about it. He probably doesn't really care about his wife's religion very much. But when he hears this guy, this preacher of this new religion is coming to my land, he's a little scared because coming from paganism and even some of his own Celtic background, he's like, what sort of mysticism or tricks is this guy gonna do? So he refuses to meet Augustine inside. He arranges an outdoor meeting. That way, it's a little bit safer for him. And Augustine shows up with about 40 helpers bearing a silver standard of the cross. And the whole thing is what's going to happen? Is Ethelbert going to tell him, get the heck out of here? Or is he going to tell him he can come into England and evangelize? And the meeting goes well because Augustine gets Ethelbert's blessing to go in to the land. And eventually, the king himself becomes a Christian. And Augustine begins starting churches and planting monasteries, that sort of thing. And within about 100 years of his death, most of Britain had also converted to Christianity. Now, Patrick gets a lot of attention, rightfully. But in order to really appreciate the role that God used Augustine of Canterbury for, I provide a list there of some of the important ways that England has actually played a significant role in the history of the church and Christianity. So if you look through that list, look at some of the famous figures and movements and events that have come out of England. All of that goes back to Augustine meeting King Ethelbert under that silver cross in an open field. From that one meeting and Augustine's bravery to go into this land, you have the Christianization of England, and it would change the world forever. The last guy we'll look at, then we'll wrap up, is Saint Boniface of Germany. Now, Boniface was actually a product of Augustine of Canterbury's work, because by the time Boniface was born in the late 600s, the land was overwhelmingly Christian. Boniface was raised by Christian parents. He was educated in a monastery. He becomes a monk when he's 30. And very early on, Boniface has this burning desire to bring the gospel into other pagan lands. Now, he tries several times, and his attempts get shut down. The heathen kings aren't all as receptive as Ethelbert. They all say, no, we don't want you here. And then it looks like maybe Boniface isn't cut out for missionary work. Maybe he's meant to stay in the monastery because the abbot of his monastery died, and everybody wanted Boniface to become the new abbot. So, okay, maybe your calling isn't out on the mission field. Maybe it's here in the monastery. But Boniface feels the call of evangelism and turns down the offer. And he continues to look for missionary opportunities. Well, that catches the attention of Pope Gregory II. And so he wants to kind of put that lightning in a bottle, capture that fire, and he commissions Boniface as a missionary bishop into what is now known as Germany. So the Germanic countries were still deeply steeped in paganism. And so the Pope now gives him all the support that he would need. And so Boniface goes into Germany and he begins planting churches and starting monasteries. And he was loved by many of the English monks and nuns back home. So not only did the Pope support him, but they would send him gifts and encouraging letters as well. Now, I want to close with a very famous story from the life of Boniface. This came in the year 723. Now, the paganism practiced by the people of Germany involved the worship of gods that were the same gods as Norse mythology. So if you're familiar with Norse mythology, you know about like Odin and Thor and Loki. Well, the Germanic peoples worship the same gods, they just gave them different names. So in Nordic theology, mythology, you have Thor. In the Germanic mythology, you have Donar. But it's the same guy. It's the god of thunder. Well, there was a very famous tree called Donar's oak or Thor's oak, and many pagan rituals and even sacrifices were offered there, including human sacrifices. And so this tree had massive religious and symbolic importance to the locals there. Now, when Boniface arrives at this tree, a bunch of the religious folk were there, supposedly with a small child, and they're about to offer this child as a sacrifice at this tree. And they have an axe. They're going to use the axe to butcher this child and offer him to the pagan gods. Or they're going to offer him up specifically to Thor, the hammer god of thunder. And when Boniface sees this, he snatches up the axe, bellows out, "Here is the thunder oak, and here the cross of Christ shall break the hammer of the false god Thor." And then he proceeds to use that axe to chop down the tree. Then, like an absolute boss, he uses the lumber from the tree to build a church on that very spot. And this was like a definitive picture in the eyes of the locals of Christ's triumph over their gods. Thor, the hammer god of thunder, was utterly helpless as this little monk comes in and hacks down this tree and builds a church out of it. And that was all the convincing thing. Christ was mightier than these gods. And so the whole area becomes converted and gets baptized. Now, according to legend, and again, this is legend, but it's still fun to talk about. This happened on December 24th. And when Boniface chops down this tree, he points to a young evergreen nearby and says, "This little tree, a young child of the forest, this shall be your holy tree tonight. It is the wood of peace. It is the sign of an endless life, for its leaves are ever green. See how it points upward to heaven. Let this be called the tree of the Christ child." Again, probably legend, but it certainly adds to the imagery of Christianity's triumph, because while these pagans are about to forcefully sacrifice a child at the foot of a tree to their bloodthirsty gods, the Christian story is about the Son of God on Christmas of all times coming to earth as a child in order to willingly offer himself up on a tree for us. And so it was like the reverse opposite of the pagan story. And this Son of God, who humbled himself by becoming a child and dying on a tree, this Son of God was able to take down Thor. And so the cutting down of the oak, the building of the church, even these legendary details, that depicted the conquest of the Christian story over the pagan ones. So we have covered a lot tonight. And in all these things, we've seen Jesus's continued faithfulness. We've seen the conversion of Constantine and how, even though it wasn't perfect, it was used for real good in the empire. We've seen how even when the Roman Empire fell, the church was standing strong. The city of God held fast, and people began looking to the church for its stability and for its help. We've seen how even when Christianity began to get soft, there were committed men and women who wanted to live a life of self-denial and absolute commitment to Christ and communion with God. It was isolationist at first, not good, so they formed communities. And these communities, these monasteries, became real forces of good in the world. And then we talked about the missionaries who bravely went where their life was on the line. They stood up to the pagan gods, and God used them to draw these people to himself, including many of these nations that still have strong Christian presences to this day. So in every age, Jesus has been and will continue to be faithful to build this church. Let's pray.